that I am beginning to build. So just kind of remember this. I'll circle back to it later in the presentation, but I want you to have a visual marker for what a family dynasty in its beginning can look like. And don't tell Sparrow, but one of my favorite newer titles is Black Wealth Futurist. And what I mean by that is while we often are so reminded so often about our trauma and about the pain that has brought us to this place, a lot of what I focus on is without living there, without living in that pain, what can our future look like when we learn, when we take the lessons from that pain and from what our ancestors and even what we ourselves have been through. So I focus on the future of Black wealth and from an asset-based perspective as opposed to the trauma-informed perspective that social media, that society wants us to think that's all who we are. So that's just a little bit about who I am, but I want to share more about how I got here. So I spent 11 years teaching entrepreneurship. About 4 or 5 years into teaching, I was looking around my classroom where on campus there was an enrollment of 10,000 students, and I would have maybe 10 or 12 students enroll in this class. And I'm looking around because let Instagram or Facebook tell it, entrepreneurship is the easiest thing to do, it's the most approachable thing to do, and it is certainly the sexiest thing since sliced bread. But I couldn't understand where all the students were. And so I did some due diligence and really found out that there was a barrier. There was an institutional barrier that was put in place that was preventing students from even being able to see themselves as entrepreneurs. And what I mean by that, there was a prerequisite that was required. So I'm not sure how long it's been since you had to choose and select between, okay, I only get these 12 electives for 4 years. I gotta choose wisely. In the case of this barrier, in the case of this prerequisite, a student had to use, if you weren't a business student or a communication student, that was the challenge. You had to use 2 electives to get into an entrepreneurship course. And that means that, because I'm not about to use 2 electives just for one single class, that means that if I'm not one of those majors, I literally could not see myself as an entrepreneur because that course does not show up in my selection. So we're talking about how, hopefully unintentionally, institutions, our own institutions, are putting barriers in place that are preventing our students, ourselves, our children, our grandchildren from seeing the real possibilities. And I went back and forth by email because what nobody tells you as an educator are about the politics of education. Like, I went in saying, through my very entrepreneurial perspective, well, here's a problem that I've explored or experienced. This is a solution that I like to implement, which is removing the prerequisite. But it certainly is not that simple in higher education, which I learned the hard way. But I recognize in retrospect that I was advocating for access to entrepreneurship education from a very heart-centered place, really wanting to, through this compassionate lens, ensure that people had access to things that sometimes we didn't even know we needed. But I didn't have the evidence. I didn't have the logic. I didn't have the reasoning. And that's how I ended up in grad school. So I'm a product of the Antioch University Graduate School of Leadership and Change, which is a social justice leadership program. We're an interdisciplinary group, about 30 of us, studying all different forms of problems in our practice areas, but working to create change through this social justice lens. How do we make sure that even the most marginalized voices, even the voices and experiences that no one wants to consider important, are a part of the solution? And that is the research that I did through this perspective of how do we make sure that entrepreneurship is easier to access no matter where you are on campus or in the community, and certainly no matter where you are in your current lived experience. So along the way, I came across this study titled The Billionaire Bonanza. And this is the report that started it all. This is the report that made me really want to dig my heels in to become a solutions provider around why, if in 2015, when I was writing the personal statement for my doctoral program, American Express had just issued this report, African American women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs. This was in 2015. I remember citing it in my dissertation, in my personal statement, and like 2 or 3 reports along the way. But if African American women were the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs, why did the economic position of African American and Black families look the same that it did decades earlier? And we are excited about generational wealth. We're starting businesses, we're getting access, we have relationships, but our economic position is not different. And so the curious part of me wanted to explore that. Like, why hasn't that changed? And then I came across this study. This is where I found the answer. So the subtitle of this study, So the Institute of Policy Studies, they issue this Billionaire Bonanza report every year. It just so happened that in 2018, they were studying the inherited wealth dynasties of the United States. And so this was a new concept to me. I had never heard of this phrase, inherited wealth dynasties. You hear of inheritances and you hear of wealth, and maybe you've heard of dynasty in the TV show, but not necessarily in the context of businesses or of families, certainly not of families. What I learned from that report was that out of America's 400 wealthiest families, a third of them had inherited wealth from an entrepreneur in their family in prior generations. So, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, so I'll stop there and move to the next slide. But when we think about the Rockefeller family, the Walton family, those are easy to think about how money is inherited. What I hadn't really put together, even as a business graduate, holding a master's in business, having been in business for myself, teaching entrepreneurship, but there was still this body of knowledge that was outside of my realm, outside of what I understood wealth to be. And that was how we transfer wealth. Those are some of the things that we aren't typically informed about, that we aren't typically taught in a structured way. If you have been the beneficiary of some wealth, then hopefully you've also learned how they did it. You are learning how to make more of it, and you are teaching this next generation or the rising generations how they can continue to perpetuate it. Unfortunately, the statistics show that by and large, that's just not our experience as people from what they're calling now, so not minority, not marginalized, but socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. So you'll start to hear that term a lot more, especially if you're in the government contracting space, community development, public funding, education. You'll start to hear this term SEDI, S-E-D-I, a lot more. I actually live now in the DC area and spend a lot of time studying what's happening on the legislative and congressional floor. And that's where I'm seeing this language show up over and over and over. So with that being said, after having come across this report, the Billionaire Bonanza, Inherited Wealth Dynasties, I finally was able to say, basically, because my interim dean and I at the time, we kind of went back and forth on why there needed to be a prerequisite, why I shared that I was so passionate about advocating for entrepreneurship education. I just didn't have the language. I didn't have the words. I just knew from my lived experience. I just knew from this core memory that I have as a 13-year-old who had to spend my 13th birthday by myself because my mom was working 2 jobs to make ends meet. I thought, in my infinite teenage wisdom, because I had all the answers back then, which is probably why Sparrow thinks she has all the answers right now. I thought back then that my mom was choosing work instead of being there with me in these milestone moments. I thought that it was something about me that made her not want to be there with me all the time. And it wasn't until I was in my doctoral journey, as the kids say, I was today years old, when I was humbled and began to understand that she wasn't there because she didn't have a choice. She didn't have the opportunity to be there because we had not inherited anything. And so when I came across this study that really looked at, and the title says, the importance of entrepreneurship for wealth concentration, I said, this is it. This is the reason. This is why, because I didn't have to work. I just had a feeling. I just had an experience. I just had an identity. I just had a narrative around why entrepreneurship, especially for socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, was so important. This study showed that when you control for race, so it doesn't matter what your ethnic background is, when you control for money or income, so it doesn't matter how much money is coming into the household, an employed household, and you compare it to an entrepreneurial household, the entrepreneurial household will experience wealth mobility faster. They will generate and create wealth faster in an entrepreneurial household than they will in an employed household. And that was the language that I needed to go back to the dean and say, this is why it needs to be easier for students to have access to entrepreneurship education. My argument was not every student needs to be an entrepreneur, because everybody can't be an entrepreneur. If everybody's an entrepreneur, then we won't have any employees and we can't grow and scale our businesses, right? But we all need the entrepreneurial mindset. We all need access to entrepreneurial mentors and resources. So this was really the last argument, or the last piece of the information that I needed to be able to go back to the administration and say, this is what we need to be providing for our students. And that actually helped me to make a connection from different parts of history to how we were experiencing entrepreneurship today. So for those of you who are founders or friends of founders, one of the things that I found, I've actually worked for the Small Business Development Center. I served as a certified business analyst with the Small Business Development Center in Florida. As I shared, taught entrepreneurship for 11 years, and even traveled to Indonesia and have worked with entrepreneurs. No matter where I am and working with entrepreneurs, especially entrepreneurs of color, there is always, what I hear is this unspoken fear, doubt in ourselves, and this insecurity. Because I'm doing all the things. I've tried all the things. I sent I've mailed out invitations. I've posted on social media. I've been on interviews, but where is my breakthrough? And so something that happens, what ends up happening is, I'm not good enough. I'm not doing this right. Maybe this isn't for me. But what we aren't being informed about, or what we aren't being taught, is the social system that we're operating in. So one part of the research that I conducted was the Black entrepreneurial experience. So as I shared, DEI is a curse word. It might get you fined. It might even get you put in jail if we aren't careful, if we aren't getting enough of our people out to vote this election year. One of the things that I found is the impact that racism, structural racism, has had on Black entrepreneurs. So not just the Black experience, but the Black entrepreneurial experience. And one of those, especially if you're thinking about, I need to get an investment to grow my business. I need to get in front of a banker in order to get access to capital. I need to make sure that I have all the things because of the socialization, because of the conditioning, right? Because of grind culture that says you have to do all the things in order to get to this next level. But if we look at some of these important constructs of, quote, entrepreneurial success, one of those things is social capital. Who's in your network? Where are your relationships? But the impact of structural racism on the development of social capital, that is a barrier that has impeded where our relationships are. That actually, we can date that back to 1896. So for any historians in the room, that was when the landmark ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, nearly 200 years beyond chattel slavery, beyond the start of chattel slavery, was when the federal government legalized racial segregation. So if in order for me to have relationships with bankers or people with private funding means that I need to be able to be in the same room with them, except it was illegal for me to do that, how then will I really build the social capital and the relationships that are going to get me access to money? So we think that all of the reports, right? Black founders of color didn't get access to PPP loans because they didn't have relationships with bankers. The better question is, what was in place that prevented me from having relationships with bankers? Was it because I wasn't intelligent enough? Because my business plan wasn't solid enough? Was it because I didn't know my financials? Or was there something else at play that went unspoken but yet was implied? And we can date that back to 1896. So this is nothing that we have created. This is nothing that those particular bankers have maybe necessarily created. But these are some of the things that are at play in the social system that we're building these businesses in and in the environment that we're trying to create wealth within. So moving forward to 1940, this particular study was conducted by a white male mathematician. He wanted to see in the 1940s, why were Black-owned insurance firms generating less income than white-owned insurance firms? So these are conversations the conversations we're having today are not new conversations. What he found was that because of racialized segregation, Black business owners, their customers were typically only other Black people. Now, these Black people were also facing discrimination in the employment market. So they weren't making as much money. If they had homes, they were the victims of predatory lending. Their mortgage rates were higher. So their discretionary income was lower, meaning they could not afford to purchase insurance policies that had the higher premium. So this is how racialized segregation impacts how Black-owned businesses are generating revenue, and this is almost 100 years ago. So moving forward from there was some research, and I want to focus on what came out of 2004. Adia Harvey wanted to study what was the pathway to economic mobility. There were a lot of studies that were showing Cuban American or Cuban immigrants were experiencing social and economic mobility because of their own entrepreneurial endeavors. And as it usually comes up, well, if they can do it, why can't Black people do it? So what Butler studied, what he said in 1991 was, while everyone is talking about why can't Black entrepreneurs pull themselves up by their bootstraps, he demonstrated that because of racial segregation, structural racism, there were no bootstraps, right? There is evidence that documents that. So what Harvey did was, building on that research, she wanted to see, she wanted to discover what are the specific pathways that create economic mobility for Black families, and specifically Black women. And one of the things that she found, this field where Black women entrepreneurs could do well and experience the most economic mobility, was in the beauty industry. And so I wanted to lay out that research and that background for you, so that you have the data, that you have the research that not validates, but gives you this strong foundation as a beauty entrepreneur on how you're going to take your time, talents, expertise, and resources to create a dynasty for your family. And so now we're going to get into what dynastic wealth is. I do want to point out that while this research, what she showed was that it wasn't just racism that was impacting economic mobility for us, and she focused, again, specifically on Black women entrepreneurs. It was gendered racism, because your experience as a Black woman will be different from the experience of a Black man, right? Your experience as a Black woman will be different from the experience of a Hispanic or Asian woman. And because of the social conditions, remember I talked about racialized segregation, right? Because of those social conditions, essentially what society would accept from a Black woman entrepreneur, what they would accept from a Black man entrepreneur, Asian American women and men, and the same for Hispanic American women and men, were different things. So while some of this looks stereotypical, right? Asian American women, nail salons. Asian American men, convenience stores. This looks very stereotypical, but there is evidence that shows why the stereotype is being perpetuated. And this, again, is because of how society, the broader society, has put these barriers in place that have almost herded people into specific spaces. Now, as I shared when we were talking earlier, as a Black wealth futurist, without focusing on the trauma, without staying in the trauma, but really developing this appreciative perspective of what our ancestors and what our own experiences have been, what can we do with this? This is the opportunity, because research has shown that African American women, at least up to that point, experienced the most economic mobility through their beauty entrepreneurship endeavors. The next thing that we have to make sure that we're doing is, I think these are out of order, but you all will have access to the full slide deck. The next thing that we have to do is make sure, especially as we move more into what's called the fourth industrial revolution, you have to, if you haven't already, you have to build in machine learning or artificial intelligence, some form of Web 3.0 into your business. So this is what broadly is referred to as tech enabling your business. You don't have to be a technologist, you don't have to be a web developer, but you do need to build technology into how you grow and scale your business. So that's a whole nother soapbox that I get on. But I wanted to make sure to share that our opportunity, or your opportunity as a beauty entrepreneur, to experience economic mobility and build your family's dynasty is going to largely depend on how you incorporate technology into how you deliver your products and services. I can come back to that if there are any questions about this part specifically. especially looking at these other barriers to Black wealth, including the GI Bill. So the GI Bill, if you aren't familiar, literally built middle-class America. The GI Bill was a benefit for World War II veterans to get them access to low-cost mortgages so that they can purchase homes, and free or low-cost access to education. Because of structural racism, my grandfather and many of our elders and ancestors probably did not get their GI Bill benefits, especially when we're talking about property ownership and land ownership. So real estate so not just entrepreneurship, but real estate is also an accelerant to wealth development. And if you aren't familiar with this title of redlining, or this term redlining, it's literally, and this was legal. This was a legal practice that was supported by the U.S. government that allowed bankers and mortgage lenders, they literally would take a map, a physical map. I know we don't use those things anymore. I don't even know if my daughter would know what one was if I handed it to her. They would take a map and a red pen and draw on the map, with this red pen, a line around the areas where they would provide mortgages to Black, Hispanic, if you were not a white male or white woman, where they would relegate you to a certain area. So if you look back on where you grew up, and some parts, I know where I grew up, that was the Black part of Miami. But in retrospect, it didn't happen by accident. It literally was intentional. And there was this red line around where Black families could purchase homes. Now, the mortgages that they did get were also predatory. The interest rates were high. So that goes back to when you have in that study where they looked at Black customers, they were making less money and could only afford so many of the products or services. So these are all of the social conditions that are working against you and your pursuit of generational wealth, as most people like to celebrate. But I'm going to take us a little bit beyond generational wealth and introduce this concept of dynastic wealth. So let me point this word out. This is your word for the day: phenomenology. Okay? Phenomenology. This is your word for today. Phenomenology is a research method that studies, the lived experience of a group of people. Phenomenology is proof that your lived experience is evidence. So no one can tell you that your life, your lived experience is not valid. Even if you needed to defend your experience, you can go back and say, well, from a phenomenological perspective, Dr. Whitehead said, but phenomenology is proof that your lived experience is evidence. And the research that I conducted, I studied first-generation Black entrepreneurs in the beauty industry. And there is evidence of dynastic wealth activity and wealth mobility that is happening in this group, in this particular group. So one of the things that came out of the research, the research that I conducted, is this idea that most beauty entrepreneurs and most Black entrepreneurs, by and large, are, as hard as it is, as crazy as I feel like, why am I doing this? I ask myself every other day. There is this narrative, this idea that is this story that is unfolding in my head that says the work that I'm doing is in service to someone else. I'm here making what's called these generative steps, and generative in the way that it's in service to something greater than myself. So generative or entrepreneurial generativity has been found to be a significant marker of beauty entrepreneurs, especially first-generation entrepreneurs. And that is the desire to create some future benefit specifically from your entrepreneurial activity in service, or that will move down the generational chain in service to others. So generativity-based entrepreneurship is one of the things that showed up in the research, and it says that, again, the work that I'm doing, as hard as it is, as difficult as it seems or as it feels, I'm doing this not just for me, but for others who will come behind me or come after me. So that is what's referred to as generativity-based entrepreneurship. There are some research that looks at, and even we may all be in this look, it's almost a continuum. So it's not that you're going to be generativity based or you're going to be opportunity based or necessity based. Depending on where you are in your journey, you're probably going to be one or all three. So necessity based entrepreneurship is basically saying, I got to make this money by tomorrow. What am I going to do? What are the skills that I have? What do I have access to? Because I need to find a way to make these ends meet. In our communities, Black women are the most educated across all groups. But we are often still overqualified and sometimes underemployed. So out of necessity, we're using the skills that we learned in the college dorm room, right? Or the ones that we taught ourselves in high school to make those ends meet. For Black men, because of the society that we live in, men of color who may have a justice-involved background probably can't get jobs. And so what they end up doing out of necessity, which is sometimes not always legal, but they have to make ends meet. So either way, we find ourselves pursuing entrepreneurship sometimes simply out of necessity. On the other hand, and there isn't any research that I've come across that shows based on the ethnic background, is it a necessity or an opportunity-based entrepreneur? But an opportunity-based entrepreneur is usually like, okay, I have the money to start this business. I have the relationships to get access to capital. I just need the opportunity to build a business around it. Now, that isn't always the case that I've seen in the research, but again, a lot of first-generation entrepreneurs are typically coming from or end up in a place of being generativity-based entrepreneurs. So while I may have started out of necessity, I'm now committing to it because I want to make sure that nobody else has to start out of necessity. Okay? So moving from there into what that generativity-based entrepreneurship is supposed to produce, or hopefully will produce, is what we call legacy motivation. And it's the same thing that in general, what we hear about is, I want to build a legacy, I want to transfer something down. There's research that showed out of Black entrepreneurs, Mexican-American entrepreneurs, Korean Americans, and African Americans entrepreneurs have the highest levels of legacy motivation. Like, more of us want to pass something down than some of our counterparts. And we can now understand why that is from our own experience, right? We can understand why that is. On the other hand, though, because some of our kids, and this is what this study also, a separate study also showed, that the children have witnessed their parents go through so much. They've had to work so hard that they don't want to inherit the businesses. So parents, grandparents have had these highest levels among different groups of entrepreneurs, including white entrepreneurs, to pass something down. But because of the structure of the business and the environment, so this is why I got to go back to tech enabling the business. The children have not wanted to inherit that business and take it on. So one thing about Dynastic Wealth is teaching that it doesn't have to be the same business, but there is the transfer of knowledge that's required. So while we, and just kind of making sure I'm checking the time, while we get into what that means, let's see. let's get now beyond generational wealth. So I introduced the Inherited Wealth Dynasty study. By academic definition, a family, your family won't even reach dynastic status until your grandchildren have control of your business or of your assets. Not that you have a grandchild, but that they have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the insight, the savvy to run and control the business. So the Walton family, Walmart family, they just reached dynastic status in 2015 when Sam Walton's granddaughter's husband became chair of the board. So it doesn't have to be a blood relative, but it is someone by maybe blood, marriage, or even adoption in the third generation. So most generations on average are about 20 years. That means the way that you operate your business today, Lisa, you have to be thinking about 60 years from now. How do I make sure that whichever family member begins to take control of how the business operates, you have to build that in now. So that means all that institutional knowledge that is up here needs to be documented. And in order to transfer your expertise and your knowledge and your insight, you have to make it in a way that other people can learn to do the job, at least for today's standards, while also at the same time preparing them for what tomorrow's standards are going to be as well. So moving beyond that, just talked a little bit about how to reach dynastic status. And I'll share this. High net worth and ultra high net worth families, they don't even use the term generational. They are not talking about generational wealth. That is, for our families, the starting point. That's not where we finish. So that first slide said beyond generational wealth, and this is the beauty of dynastic wealth, is that it begins with you, but it never ends. So it's not something that, okay, Nuekie, Eunice's daughter, okay, as long as Nuekie's good, I did what I was supposed to do. The word says, for any Christians in here, the word says a righteous man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. So that means when we get to the grandchild, they are still leaving an inheritance for their children's children. And that's how it becomes infinite. That's how it perpetuates, is when we understand that even our objectives as believers is to make sure that those who come behind us have been provided for. So this entrepreneurial dynasty, again, they maintain control, not just ownership, because while I have on a pair of Jordans, I don't have no Nike stock. So I don't have no Nike stock, so I have no control. And while we're talking about, okay, this shoe came out, or this brand, but where's your control? How much stock do you have in the company? So we've talked about entrepreneurship as an accelerant to wealth, real estate, and stock ownership, right? How much control do you have? And then ensuring that a family, this says a family. So I want to pinpoint that, because a lot of technical assistance programs, you might go to the Small Business Development Center, maybe, and you can learn more about what's called the Capital Readiness Program, which is a federally funded through the Department of Treasury and Minority Business Development Agency technical assistance program. They're looking at how to help you, how to help grow your business. But who's going to talk with you about what do I do with this newfound economic mobility that I have? I don't know what to do with this money besides maybe put it in a bank, maybe spend it, right? Because I got this wish list that goes on and on and on. But how do I make sure that now, if I'm the rich auntie, what does that mean for how I engage with my family? What does that mean for what I do for my community? And so what we have to do is get beyond generational wealth and also get beyond just technical assistance. So from here, the conditions are that your family has controlled the business for 3 consecutive generations, the business, or controlled the wealth. So in the Walmart family or the Walton family, they are an example of condition A. They've controlled the business. The Rockefeller family, which is another one that we all celebrate and think about when we're talking about generational wealth, they're an example of a family that's controlled the wealth. So the Rockefellers do not have a core business the way the Walton family does. But they hadn't had a core business since 1911. But they remain among America's 25 wealthiest families for the last 100 years. So honestly, do we think they're only passing down money? There's no way. There's absolutely no way. And now we have the data that proves it. So there's the poster board here, there's a handout, and then there's also the QR code for the slide. So any way that you learn, whether you're a visual learner, auditory, tactile, where you need to hold something and write it. So the research shows that dynastic families are passing down. Remember, we already talked about 3 generations, right? 3 generations of control. They're passing down 5 forms of wealth. And this isn't just stocks, real estate, entrepreneur. That's only one. Those are 3 different examples of one form of wealth. So when we're talking about generational wealth, we're typically only referring to financial wealth. We're only referring to money. But we got some informal agreement here that money isn't everything that it takes. It takes more than just money. And so the research shows that there are these other 4 forms of wealth, qualitative wealth. And especially in our families, in our communities, we haven't been taught that our family history, our family recipes, our family values, we haven't been taught that that is wealth. That means wealth is literally coursing through your veins. But we haven't been taught what to do with it or how to recognize it. We certainly haven't been taught how to protect it and pass it down. And so that's what the framework for dynastic wealth does. But I want to point out this right here. It says generative script. So remember earlier I referred to generativity. And that's the idea that the work that you're doing is in service to someone else. The generative script is the inner narrative that you have about who you are and that you believe that the work that you're doing is in service to someone else. I had a colleague ask me, well, is this framework, so can only entrepreneurs start dynasties? And I said, absolutely not. It's just that it's going to take, as entrepreneurs, how many years have you all been in business? More than 1 year, raise your hand. Okay. More than 5 years. Okay. More than 10 years? Okay. How many years you been in business, Lisa? Wow. Oh my God, that deserves a round of applause. Congratulations. Congratulations. It's okay. It's okay. The only advantage I have is that I've been studying this for 4 years. That's my only advantage. And I'm not going to sit up here and cry. But if it were not for Eunice, we still wouldn't know, right? Eunice is the reason I went to grad school. So whenever she needs me, I wouldn't be here. Thank you. So a part of what I'm sharing is generative, right? It's to make sure that we all get as many of the tools as we didn't know we needed. So when in spiritual wealth, and someone, I'm sorry, I don't even think I finished that part about is dynastic wealth only for entrepreneurs. It's not, and I saw a cosign in the back. Thank you from my amen corner in the back. The idea is, if you've ever tried to talk to another black person about money, you know it takes a certain kind of grit, resilience. You got to have a thick skin, and that's what you get out of entrepreneurship, right? Because of the lows that you have been able to live through and talk about. Oh, I can sit here and talk to these 16 very, very strong-willed black people in my family about money, right? So it may not take an entrepreneur, but remember earlier, we all need the entrepreneurial mindset. And so in building out your family's dynasty, so I want to talk really quickly about these 4 other forms of wealth. Spiritual wealth, and I think I have it, and we'll go back to this. Spiritual wealth, this is the idea. So going back to generativity, this is the idea that there's a greater purpose. So greater works, right? There's a greater purpose than merely financial gain from your entrepreneurial endeavors. Spiritual wealth is about who are we as a family? Who am I as a member of the family? What is my identity in this family? And that's not to say that all family relationships are going to be rainbows and unicorns, because I got to the place where I thought it was just going to be me and Sparrow. But that was enough, right? Because I needed to make sure that I knew who I was so that I can translate that to her and her understanding and developing her own identity. So even if it was just this part of my grandmother's lineage, just me and her, it was, we know who we are. But by the grace of God, 16 of us, I think they're actually, so there were 4 generations. My grandmother recently transitioned. So our family matriarch, she was 91. But there were 4 generations of us that were doing this work. And we were actively involved. And it took us 2.5 years, right? Because we would meet once a week and we would just get on Zoom and everything like that. And then, of course, life happens. And then, of course, we all have our own ideas about things. And so it wasn't easy. But when my grandmother transitioned last month, we didn't have to be afraid of how the family would splinter, because we had spent this time documenting who we were. It wasn't just something, oh, this is who I think we are, and my cousin feels this way. No, we were having open conversations about what's the through line for our family and for our family identity. And so our family values, the vision for wealth. The word says, where there is no vision, the people shall perish. So if you have no vision for wealth, how can we expect to have enough of it to pass down? Now, one of the things that high net worth families, they struggle with is they have to build in space for future generations to have an identity outside of their wealth. And that's where that kind of entitlement comes into play that we hear a lot about, see a lot about. But all of these things become the language that go into your family constitution. The family constitution is basically the document. This is your inheritance, knowing who you are. Right? You don't have to go out and explore and see what social media or whatever is current in pop culture is telling you about who you are. This is your inheritance. This is what tells you how this family generated wealth, where our family properties are. We won't have to lose any properties to heirs property. We won't have to lose any assets to probate. So our family constitution is what literally is the governing document for how we package, protect, and pass down our wealth. And so what that does, that document becomes how you engage with an estate planner. So in the work that I do with Black founders and their families is I help to match them with Black estate planners I sit on the board for the Association of Black Estate Planning Professionals, and so I get the opportunity to really see, okay, are you really for the people type of thing, right? But in the one thing that I hadn't updated, did I? I hadn't updated is a family retreat. So how many of you, is this your year for a family reunion? Okay. Okay, this is my larger family's year for a family reunion as well. And are you coming to the cookout? Did you order your t-shirt? Do you have your scholarship banquet ticket? But how do I make sure that Sparrow got what she need? And that my other cousins are ready for high school and college? Why aren't we talking about those things? And high net worth and ultra high net worth families, they don't have family reunions. Just like they aren't talking about generational wealth. They have family retreats. And so in this family retreat, and our family hasn't had one yet, but each generation is engaged. So if we take the example, with the fourth generation, had my grandmother still been with us, my daughter and her cousins, the youngest generation, they would literally ceremoniously open the family retreat by reading the family constitution. So that's their reminder, their constant reminder of who you are, where you came from, where this money came from, and what are the opportunities for us to pass it down and to perpetuate it. My cousins and I, so the next generation up, would be looking at reviewing our investment portfolio. Where did we put the money that we earned? So we agreed, after a lot of discussion, because we had no collective assets, we had to build it. And we agreed that we would each put in $1,000 a year over 3 years to build our family assets. And by the time all of that money, I think we said we needed to let it build up to, I don't know, maybe like $50,000 or $75,000 or something. So all of the money would be put into, say, stocks or a whole life insurance policy to add the interest. But we could not take anything out of it until it reached this whatever that number was. So in that case, when we had gotten to the place where we can start to invest the money, what we would be doing is looking at, well, what did we earn this year, right? What did we lose this year? Where will we invest next year? What will we do with the money in future years? So that portfolio analysis is happening most likely on the second generation level. And then my aunts and uncles, my mom, they are looking at, well, Tanya requested a distribution from the family trust. These are the application criteria. Just like if we were going into a bank and doing a lending application, did you meet the criteria? Where is the return on investment coming from? How will this be recompensated back to the family trust? Because a part of the discussion or the requirements are the family trust is never depleted. Now, how do we do that, though? The idea, or at least the idea is, you cannot pay for medical expenses from a distribution from the family trust. We are not paying for burial expenses on a distribution from the family trust, because people gonna die. We will literally deplete the trust if we're paying for burial expenses. But one of the implied obligations for each family member is that you have your own individual estate planning documents in place, so that we don't have to feel like, well, are we deserting our family members because they can't pay for their burial expenses? No. A part of your personal obligation is you have your own estate planning documents so as not to cause any detriment to the family estate plan. Now, and these are the last couple minutes that I'll use, and then just quickly kind of talk through the remaining forms of wealth. But you heard me refer to Sparrow, so that first generation. I said my cousins and I, my sister, my cousins and I, that's second generation. And then my mom and aunts and uncles. So that third generation up, or in reverse, is the second generation. So 3 generations of control, 5 forms of wealth, but 4 directions of wealth transfer. So in generational wealth, I can't transfer something up, right? Because I'm usually thinking about people who are coming after me. What about the people before me? What about my mom? How do I transfer wealth to her through generational wealth? I can't. With dynastic wealth, I can transfer spiritual wealth. I can help her understand her identity as a part of this family. I can transfer intellectual wealth, which is the idea that I want to help her become the best version of herself, no matter in what capacity that is. I can transfer relational wealth, which is my social capital. Who do I know? Who do I have relationships with that she can benefit from? So dynastic families are not just passing down money, they're passing down knowledge. They're passing down identity and values. They're passing down relationships. And so those are the major distinctions between generational wealth and dynastic wealth. And the beauty of it all is you all are at an inflection point. We already know research shows that Black women entrepreneurs experience economic mobility, at least historically, they've experienced economic mobility through beauty entrepreneurship. We already know that dynastic families are not concerned with just generational wealth. So now what do? It's your charge taking this information and beginning to build your family dynasty. And that's all I have. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we have, go ahead, Eunice.
So I'm going to bring Dr. Evans to the stage because I want this to be a panel discussion.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.